The yellow school bus came to a stop with a loud hiss of brakes. 12-year-old David stepped off carefully, clutching his worn backpack tighter than usual. The morning air was crisp, and he could see his breath forming small clouds as he looked up at Riverside Elementary School. The building was much bigger than his old school back in Chicago, with red brick walls and tall windows that seemed to watch him as he walked toward the entrance. David had been dreading this day for weeks. Moving to a new town was hard enough, but starting at a new school in the middle of February felt like jumping into a cold lake. His parents had tried to make it sound exciting when they told him about the move. His father had gotten a good job at the paper mill just outside of town, and his mother was happy they could finally afford a small house with a yard. But for David, it meant leaving behind his friends, his old teacher who understood him, and everything familiar. As he walked through the front doors, David noticed how different everything looked. The hallways were wider and cleaner than his, old school. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and there were colorful posters everywhere about reading and math. But what struck him most was how quiet it seemed. Back in Chicago, his school was always buzzing with noise and energy. Here, students walked in neat lines and spoke in hushed voices. The principal, Mr. Thompson, was waiting for him at the main office. He was a tall man with graying hair and a kind smile that reached his eyes. "You must be David," he said warmly, extending his hand for a shake. "Welcome to Riverside Elementary. We're so glad to have you here." David shook his hand politely, just like his grandmother had taught him. "Thank you, sir," he replied quietly. Mr. Thompson showed him around the school, pointing out the library, the cafeteria, and the gymnasium. "You'll be in Mrs. Peterson's 5th grade class," he explained as they walked down the hallway. "She's one of our best teachers, been here for 15 years and really cares about her students." When they reached the classroom, David could hear the sound of children's voices discussing something about fractions. Mr. Thompson knocked gently on the door before opening it. The room fell silent as 22 pairs of eyes turned to look at the new student standing in the doorway. Mrs. Peterson was a woman in her 40s with brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore a friendly smile and a sweater with tiny apple patterns on it. "Class, I'd like you to meet David," she announced. "He's joining us from Chicago, and I know you'll all make him feel welcome." A few students said hello, but David noticed that most of them just stared. He was used to being one of many black students at his old school, but here he seemed to be the only one. The feeling made his stomach twist a little, but he reminded himself of what his father had told him just that morning. "Hold your head high, son. You belong wherever you are." Mrs. Peterson assigned him a seat next to a freckled boy named Tommy, who seemed friendly enough. "We're working on long division right now," she explained, handing him a math worksheet. "Don't worry if you're not caught up. We'll make sure you get any help you need." David looked at the problems and realized they were actually easier than what he'd been doing at his old school. He finished the worksheet quickly and quietly, then looked around the room while waiting for the other students to finish. The classroom was bright and organized, with student artwork covering one wall and a reading corner with comfortable beanbags in the corner. During recess, Tommy showed him around the playground. "That's the basketball court," he said, pointing to a fenced area with 2 hoops. "Do you like basketball? I bet you're really good at it." David shrugged. He was decent at basketball, but his real passion was something most people didn't expect. "I'm okay," he said simply. The lunch period was harder. David sat with Tommy and a few other boys who seemed nice enough, but he could feel other students looking at him from across the cafeteria. Some were just curious, but others seemed to be whispering about him. He focused on his sandwich and tried to ignore the attention. After lunch, the students filed into the music room for their weekly music class. This was the part of the day David had been both looking forward to and dreading. Music had always been his favorite subject, but he worried about how he'd fit in with a new teacher and new classmates. The music room was impressive, with instruments lining the walls and a beautiful black piano sitting in the center like a king on its throne. David's eyes immediately went to the piano, and he felt his fingers twitch slightly, remembering the feeling of keys beneath them. Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher, was arranging sheet music on her desk when the students entered. She was an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and glasses that sat on the tip of her nose. She looked up as the students took their seats on the carpeted floor in front of her. "Good afternoon, class," she said in a crisp voice that commanded attention. Her eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly when they reached David. He noticed her expression change slightly, though he couldn't quite read what the look meant. "Today we're going to continue learning about classical composers," Mrs. Henderson announced. "Can anyone tell me who composed the Four Seasons?" Several hands shot up and she called on a girl with blonde pigtails. "Vivaldi," the girl answered proudly. "Very good, Jennifer," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. "Classical music is an important part of our cultural heritage. It requires discipline, proper training, and an understanding of musical tradition that not everyone possesses." As she spoke, David noticed her eyes drift toward him again. Something in her tone made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't put his finger on why. He shifted slightly on the carpet, trying to focus on what she was saying about different composers and their contributions to music. The class continued with Mrs. Henderson playing recordings of various pieces and asking students to identify the instruments they heard. David knew all the answers but kept his hand down, not wanting to draw attention to himself on his first day. He'd learned that sometimes it was better to observe and listen before speaking up. When the music class ended and the students filed back to their regular classroom, David couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Henderson had been watching him more closely than the other students. It wasn't the friendly curiosity he'd gotten from Mrs. Peterson or the open interest from his classmates. There was something else in her gaze, something that made him feel like he was being judged before she even knew anything about him. As the final bell rang and David gathered his things to head home, he reflected on his first day. Most of it had gone better than he'd expected. His teacher seemed kind, his classmates were mostly friendly, and the work wasn't too difficult. But that look from Mrs. Henderson stuck with him as he walked to the bus. Little did David know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would test not only his resilience, but also challenge everything Mrs. Henderson thought she knew about talent, potential, and the dangerous assumptions we make about people based on how they look. 2 weeks had passed since David's first day at Riverside Elementary, and he was starting to find his rhythm. His regular classes were going well, and he'd even made a few friends. Tommy had introduced him to other kids during lunch, and some of them had started including him in their conversations about video games and sports. Mrs. Peterson had been especially kind, staying after class a couple of times to make sure he was caught up with the curriculum. But there was one class that continued to make David uncomfortable, and that was music with Mrs. Henderson. It wasn't that the subject matter was difficult. In fact, David found himself knowing more about classical music than most of his classmates. When Mrs. Henderson played a piece by Mozart, David could often identify not just the composer, but sometimes even the specific piece. When she talked about different musical periods, David understood the connections between composers and their influences. But he kept this knowledge to himself, sensing that speaking up might not be welcomed. Mrs. Henderson had a way of looking at him during class that made David feel like he was under a microscope. She never called on him directly, but he could feel her eyes on him whenever she asked questions about musical theory or composers. It was as if she was waiting for something, though David couldn't figure out what. During lunch on a particularly cold Thursday, David overheard Mrs. Henderson talking to another teacher in the hallway outside the cafeteria. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried as he walked past with his lunch tray. "These transfer students from the inner city," Mrs. Henderson was saying, shaking her head. "They come here without any real foundation in the arts. It's not their fault, really, but we have to be realistic about what we can expect from them." David felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. He knew she was talking about him, even though she hadn't mentioned his name. He wanted to turn around and tell her about all the piano lessons he'd taken, about the competitions he'd won, about how his grandmother had started teaching him to play when he was just 4 years old. But instead he kept walking, his appetite suddenly gone. The following Monday, Mrs. Henderson announced something that made David's stomach drop. "Class, next week we're going to do something special," she said, adjusting her glasses as she looked. presentation where each of you will have a chance to share your understanding of classical music with your classmates. Several students groaned, but Mrs. Henderson held up her hand for silence. This isn't just about memorizing facts, she continued. It's about demonstrating your cultural knowledge and your ability to understand the sophisticated world of classical music. Some of you have been fortunate enough to grow up in homes where this kind of education was valued and provided. Again, David noticed her eyes drift in his direction. The way she emphasized certain words made it clear that she didn't expect much from him. He could feel his classmates looking at him too, and he wondered if they could sense the tension in the room. That afternoon, David went home feeling anxious about the upcoming presentation. His mother noticed his mood right away. "Everything okay at school, baby?" she asked, looking up from the dinner she was preparing. David hesitated. He didn't want to worry his parents, especially when they were so happy about the move and his father's new job. "It's fine, Mom," he said, "just some school stuff." But his mother wasn't fooled. She sat down at the kitchen table and patted the chair next to her. "Come here and talk to me. What's really going on?" David found himself telling her about Mrs. Henderson and the music class, about the way the teacher looked at him and the things she'd said in the hallway. His mother listened carefully, her expression growing more serious as he spoke. "That woman doesn't know who you are," his mother said firmly when he finished. "She doesn't know about all those Saturday mornings you spent with Grandma Rose learning to play piano. She doesn't know about the recitals or the competitions or how you used to practice for hours just because you loved it." David nodded, but he still felt uncertain. "Maybe I should just keep quiet during the presentation. I don't want to cause any trouble." His mother took his hands in hers. "David, your grandmother always told you that music is a universal language. She said it doesn't matter what color you are or where you come from. Music speaks to everyone's soul. Don't you dare hide your light under a bushel because someone else is too narrow-minded to see it shine." The next day in music class, Mrs. Henderson began assigning topics for the presentations. She called students up one by one to draw topics from a hat. Jennifer got Beethoven, Tommy drew Bach, and another girl picked Tchaikovsky. When it was David's turn, Mrs. Henderson watched him carefully as he reached into the hat. David unfolded his paper and read the name silently. Chopin. His heart jumped a little. Chopin was one of his favorite composers, someone whose music he'd been playing for years. But as he looked up at Mrs. Henderson, he saw something in her expression that made him uneasy. "What did you get, David?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew. "Chopin," David replied quietly. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, and David could swear he saw a small smile play at the corners of her mouth. "Ah, Chopin. A very sophisticated composer. Very complex. His nocturnes and etudes require a deep understanding of musical theory and cultural context. I hope you'll be able to do justice to such an important figure in classical music." The way she said it made it clear that she didn't think he would be able to handle the assignment. David felt his face grow warm, but he just nodded and returned to his seat. Over the next few days, David threw himself into researching Chopin. He already knew quite a bit about the composer's life and work, but he wanted to make sure his presentation was perfect. He spent hours at the library after school, reading about Chopin's time in Paris, his relationship with George Sand, and the way his Polish heritage influenced his compositions. But as the presentation day approached, David could sense that Mrs. Henderson was planning something. She had started making comments during class about how some students might need alternative ways to demonstrate their understanding if they couldn't handle the academic requirements of their presentations. Sometimes, she said during one class, looking directly at David, students from certain backgrounds might be more comfortable expressing themselves through other means, perhaps something more physical rather than intellectual. David knew exactly what she was implying, and it made his blood boil. She was suggesting that he might be better suited for something involving rhythm or movement rather than serious, musical analysis. The stereotype was so obvious and hurtful that David had to clench his fists under his desk to keep from saying something he might regret. The night before his presentation, David practiced his speech in front of the mirror in his bedroom. He had prepared a thorough overview of Chopin's life, his musical innovations, and his influence on later composers. He could deliver it confidently and knowledgeably, and he was proud of the work he'd done. But deep down, he had a feeling that Mrs. Henderson wasn't going to let him give a normal presentation. The way she'd been looking at him, the comments she'd made, and the barely concealed expectations in her voice all pointed to something else. She was setting him up for something, and David suspected it wasn't going to be pleasant. As he lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, David thought about what his grandmother used to tell him about facing difficult people. Some folks, she would say, are so busy looking at the outside of a person that they forget to look at what's inside. But you can't let their blindness make you blind to your own worth. Tomorrow would be his turn to present, and David had a sinking feeling that Mrs. Henderson had plans for him that had nothing to do with his carefully prepared speech about Chopin. Whatever she was planning, he would have to be ready for it. He just hoped he would have the courage to face whatever came his way with the dignity his parents and grandmother had taught him to maintain, no matter how difficult the situation became. The morning of David's presentation arrived with gray clouds hanging low over Riverside Elementary. David had barely slept the night before, going over his speech about Chopin again and again in his mind. He'd prepared note cards with key facts about the composer's life, his musical innovations, and his lasting influence on classical music. Everything was ready for what should have been a straightforward academic presentation. During breakfast, his mother noticed his nervous energy. "You're going to do great today," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just remember what Grandma Rose always told you about confidence. Stand tall, speak clearly, and let your knowledge shine through." David nodded, but the knot in his stomach remained. Something about the way Mrs. Henderson had been acting told him this wasn't going to be as simple as giving his prepared speech. The morning classes seemed to drag on forever. During math, David found himself staring at the clock, watching the minutes tick by slowly. Mrs. Peterson noticed his distraction and gave him an encouraging smile, but it didn't ease his anxiety. When lunchtime finally arrived, David could barely eat his sandwich. Tommy tried to cheer him up by talking about the upcoming basketball game, but David's mind was elsewhere. Finally, it was time for music class. The students filed into the music room as usual, taking their seats on the carpet in front of Mrs. Henderson's desk. The beautiful black piano sat in the center of the room like always, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light from the windows. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped behind her back. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her usual stern expression. "Good afternoon, class," she said, her voice carrying its usual authority. "Today we continue with our music appreciation presentations." She called on Jennifer first, who gave a well-prepared presentation about Beethoven's symphonies. The girl had clearly done her research and spoke confidently about the composer's innovations and his influence on later musicians. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly and made encouraging comments throughout the presentation. Next was Tommy, who stumbled a bit through his presentation on Bach, but managed to cover the main points about the composer's mathematical approach to music and his importance in the Baroque period. Again, Mrs. Henderson offered gentle corrections and praise for his effort. Then she called David's name. David stood up, his note cards in hand, and walked to the front of the room. He took a deep breath and began his presentation, just as he had practiced. "Frédéric Chopin was born in Poland in 1810, he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. He's considered one of the greatest composers for piano in history, and his works are known for their emotional depth and technical brilliance." As David continued, explaining Chopin's early musical education and his move to Paris, he could see Mrs. Henderson's expression changing. She wasn't nodding approvingly like she had with the other students. Instead, she was watching him with a look that seemed almost irritated, as if his knowledge was somehow problematic. David pushed forward, discussing Chopin's nocturnes, his revolutionary etudes, and his influence on later Romantic composers. He had done his research thoroughly, and the information flowed naturally as he spoke. Several of his classmates looked impressed by how much he knew about the subject. But just as David was getting into his stride, Mrs. Henderson held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's enough," she said curtly. The interruption was so sudden that David felt like he'd been slapped. "But I haven't finished my presentation." For information about his compositions and his legacy, Mrs. Henderson shook her head dismissively. "I think we've heard enough facts for one day," she said, though she had let the other students complete their full presentations. "Besides, anyone can memorize information from books. Real understanding of classical music goes much deeper than just reciting facts." David felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. Around him, his classmates looked confused by what was happening. This wasn't how the other presentations had gone. Mrs. Henderson was clearly treating him differently, though David couldn't understand why his well-researched presentation was being dismissed. Mrs. Henderson walked over to the piano and placed her hand on its polished surface. "Since you chose Chopin as your composer," she said, her voice taking on a tone that made David's stomach drop, "perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding in a more authentic way." The way she said authentic made it clear that she was setting him up for something. David could sense the trap being laid, but he didn't know how to avoid it. "I don't understand," David said carefully. Mrs. Henderson smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Well, since Chopin was primarily a composer for piano, and since you seem so knowledgeable about his work, why don't you show us your understanding by playing one of his pieces? After all, true appreciation of music comes from being able to perform it, not just talk about it." The classroom fell completely silent. David could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on him. His classmates looked confused and uncomfortable, sensing that something unfair was happening but not understanding exactly what. David's mouth went dry. He realized what Mrs. Henderson was doing. She was putting him in an impossible situation, expecting him to fail publicly and prove her preconceived notions about him. She assumed that a black student from an inner-city school wouldn't know how to play classical piano, and she was setting him up to be humiliated in front of his classmates. "I prepared a presentation about Chopin's life and work," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's what the assignment was." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "The assignment was to demonstrate your understanding of classical music," she said firmly. "And I think playing a piece would be much more informative than simply reciting facts you found in a book. Unless, of course, you're not capable of such a demonstration." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. She was practically daring him to admit he couldn't play, which would allow her to make her point about his supposed limitations. David could see some of his classmates looking uncomfortable with what was happening, but they didn't know how to intervene. David's mind raced. He thought about his grandmother, who had spent countless hours teaching him to play. He thought about all the recitals he had performed at, all the competitions he had won, all the hours he had spent practicing because he genuinely loved music. Mrs. Henderson had no idea who he really was or what he was capable of. He looked at the piano, then back at Mrs. Henderson's expectant face. She was clearly enjoying putting him in this position, confident that she was about to prove her point about students like him. The other students waited in uncomfortable silence, not understanding the undercurrents of what was happening, but sensing the tension in the room. David realized he had two choices. He could refuse to play and let Mrs. Henderson claim victory, or he could sit down at that piano and show her exactly how wrong her assumptions were. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't you dare hide your light under a bushel because someone else is too narrow-minded to see it shine." Taking a deep breath, David walked slowly toward the piano. Mrs. Henderson stepped aside with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting to watch him fail. She had no idea that she was about to witness something that would completely shatter her preconceived notions and change everything she thought she knew about the quiet boy who had transferred from Chicago. As David approached the piano bench, his hands stopped trembling. This was his element, his sanctuary, the place where he had always felt most confident and capable. Mrs. Henderson had intended to humiliate him, but she had unknowingly given him the perfect opportunity to show everyone in that room who he really was. The silence in the classroom was absolute. as David sat down at the bench and placed his fingers gently on the keys. Mrs. Henderson stood with her arms crossed, waiting for the failure she was certain would come. But David was no longer nervous. For the first time since he'd started at Riverside Elementary, he felt completely in control of the situation. What happened next would be something that nobody in that room would ever forget. The silence in the music room was so complete that David could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind Mrs. Henderson's desk. Every student sat frozen in place, sensing that something important was about to happen, though they couldn't quite understand what. Mrs. Henderson stood with her arms crossed, a look of smug anticipation on her face as she waited for David to embarrass himself. David positioned his hands over the keys and took one final deep breath. In that moment, 8 years of piano lessons with his grandmother flashed through his mind. He remembered the first time Grandma Rose had lifted him onto the piano bench when he was just 4 years old, his little legs barely reaching the pedals. He remembered the countless Saturday mornings spent in her small living room, learning scales and arpeggios, working through beginner pieces, and gradually moving on to more complex compositions. He thought about the day his grandmother had first introduced him to Chopin's music. "This man," she had said, her weathered fingers dancing across the keys as she played a nocturne, understood that music could tell stories that words never could. He put his whole heart into every note. David had been enchanted by the beautiful, melancholy melody and had begged her to teach it to him. Now facing a room full of classmates and a teacher who had tried to humiliate him, David knew exactly which piece he wanted to play. His fingers found their position, and he began Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and recognizable pieces the composer had ever written. The first notes rang out clear and pure, filling the classroom with a sound so unexpected that several students gasped audibly. Mrs. Henderson's confident expression immediately began to change, her eyebrows raising in surprise as David's fingers moved with precision and grace across the keyboard. The melody flowed from David's hands like water, each note perfectly placed and timed. This wasn't the fumbling attempt of a beginner or the mechanical playing of someone who had just learned the piece. This was the performance of someone who truly understood the music, who felt every emotion Chopin had poured into the composition more than a century ago. As David played, the story of his musical journey unfolded in ways his classmates had never imagined. They had seen him as the quiet new kid from Chicago, but they had no idea about the depth of his talent and training. They didn't know about his grandmother, who had been a music teacher herself before she retired, or about the sacrifices his parents had made to continue his piano lessons even when money was tight. David had started competing in youth piano competitions when he was 7 years old. At first he was nervous and made mistakes, but his grandmother always encouraged him to keep trying. "Every great musician was once a beginner," she would say. "The difference is that they never gave up." By the time he was 10, David was winning competitions regularly, impressing judges with both his technical skill and his emotional interpretation of the pieces he played. The Nocturne in E-flat major was one of David's signature pieces. He had performed it dozens of times, but never under circumstances like this. As his fingers moved through the familiar passages, he felt all his nervousness and anger melting away. This was who he really was, not the struggling student Mrs. Henderson had assumed him to be, but a young musician with years of training and a genuine love for classical music. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone completely pale. The smug satisfaction in her expression had been replaced by shock, then confusion, and now something that looked almost like panic. She had been so certain that David would fail, so confident in her assumptions about his background and abilities, that she hadn't prepared for this possibility. The other students were mesmerized. Jennifer, who had been proud of her presentation about Beethoven, found herself leaning forward in amazement at the beautiful music filling the room. Tommy's mouth was hanging open as he watched his new friend's fingers dance across the keys, with such skill and confidence. Even the students who had been somewhat unfriendly toward David were now staring in awe. As David moved into the more complex middle section of the Nocturne, his playing became even more expressive. He added subtle dynamics and phrasing that showed a mature understanding of the music's emotional content. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was artistry. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and sang, telling the story that Chopin had embedded in every measure. Mrs. Henderson found herself stepping closer to the piano, drawn in despite herself by the quality of David's performance. She had taught music for over 20 years, and she recognized exceptional talent when she heard it. What she was witnessing was far beyond anything she had expected from any of her students, let alone from the boy she had dismissed so casually. When David reached the tender flowing section near the end of the piece, several students found themselves holding their breath. The music was so beautiful, so perfectly executed, that it seemed to transport everyone in the room to another place. For those few minutes, the classroom disappeared, and there was only the music and the young musician who was bringing it to life. As David played the final, delicate notes of the nocturne, letting them ring out in the suddenly sacred space of the music room, the silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded his performance. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of anticipation. This was the reverent hush that follows something truly extraordinary. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. David kept his hands on the keys, letting the last notes fade completely before he looked up. When he finally turned to face the room, he saw 22 faces staring at him in amazement and one teacher whose world had just been turned completely upside down. Then Tommy started clapping, and within seconds the entire class had erupted in enthusiastic applause. Students who had barely spoken to David were cheering and whistling their approval. Jennifer was clapping so hard her hands must have been stinging, and even the quietest kids in the class were shouting their amazement. But David's eyes were focused on Mrs. Henderson. The teacher stood frozen in place, her face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something else that David couldn't quite identify. For the first time since he'd started at Riverside Elementary, Mrs. Henderson was completely speechless. David stood up from the piano bench slowly, his heart still pounding from the performance, but his confidence fully restored. He looked directly at Mrs. Henderson and said quietly, "I've been playing piano for 8 years. My grandmother taught me that piece when I was 9 years old." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. In those few words, David had shattered every assumption Mrs. Henderson had made about him. He wasn't the culturally deprived student she had expected. He was a trained musician with years of experience and a depth of knowledge that rivaled her own. Mrs. Henderson opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Around the room, David's classmates were still buzzing with excitement, talking among themselves about the incredible performance they had just witnessed. Everything had changed in the space of those few minutes, and everyone in the room knew it. David had not only met Mrs. Henderson's challenge, he had exceeded it in ways she never could have imagined. The boy she had tried to humiliate had instead revealed her own prejudices and limitations, and there was no going back from what had just happened. The days following David's stunning piano performance felt like a completely different world at Riverside Elementary. Word of what had happened in Mrs. Henderson's music class spread through the school like wildfire. Students who had never paid much attention to David before were now seeking him out, wanting to talk about music and asking if he knew how to play their favorite songs. During lunch on Thursday, David found himself surrounded by classmates who were full of questions. "How long have you been playing?" asked a girl named Amy. "Can you play songs from movies?" wondered another boy. "Will you play something else for us sometime?" requested Jennifer, who had become much friendlier since the incident. David answered their questions patiently, still somewhat amazed by how much everything had changed. Tommy, who had been his first friend at the school, was practically bursting with pride. "I knew there was something special about you," he kept saying, even though David was pretty sure Tommy had been just as surprised as everyone else. But the biggest change was in Mrs. Henderson herself, the confident, stern teacher who had tried to embarrass David seemed to have disappeared completely. In her place was a woman who looked genuinely shaken and uncertain. She had barely spoken during the rest of that music class, dismissing the students early and sitting alone at her desk long after they had filed out. David had noticed Mrs. Henderson watching him in the hallways since then, but not with the same judgmental stare as before. Now she looked at him with something that seemed like a mixture of shame and curiosity, as if she was seeing him for the first time and didn't like what that revealed about herself. On Friday afternoon, as David was gathering his books from his locker, he heard his name called softly. He turned to see Mrs. Henderson standing a few feet away, looking more uncertain than he had ever seen her. She seemed smaller somehow, less commanding than she had appeared in her classroom. "David," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone in the hallway. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" David nodded, though his stomach tightened a little. He wasn't sure what to expect from this conversation, but he could tell it was important to her. Mrs. Henderson led him to an empty classroom and closed the door behind them. For a moment she just stood there, seeming to struggle with how to begin. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked directly at him. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I did in class the other day was wrong. Very wrong." She paused, as if the words were difficult to say. "I made assumptions about you based on things that had nothing to do with who you really are, and I'm ashamed of myself." David studied her face, seeing genuine remorse there. "You thought I couldn't play," he said simply. "It wasn't a question." Mrs. Henderson nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I thought a lot of things that weren't true, and I realize now how hurtful and unfair that was. You didn't deserve to be treated that way, and I'm truly sorry." David was quiet for a moment, processing her apology. Part of him was angry about what she had put him through, but another part of him recognized how difficult it must be for her to admit she was wrong. His grandmother had always taught him that forgiveness was more about freeing yourself than excusing someone else's behavior. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mrs. Henderson asked, genuine curiosity in her voice now. David found himself telling her about his grandmother, about the Saturday morning lessons, about the competitions and recitals. As he spoke, he could see Mrs. Henderson's expression changing, becoming more and more amazed as she realized the depth of his musical background. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman," Mrs. Henderson said when he finished. "And you're clearly a remarkable musician. I've been teaching for over 20 years and I've rarely heard playing of that caliber from someone your age." "She always told me that music doesn't care what color you are," David said. "She said it only cares if you put your heart into it." Mrs. Henderson winced slightly at his words, understanding the deeper meaning behind them. "Your grandmother was absolutely right," she said softly, "and I'm going to do better. I promise you that." Over the following weeks, Mrs. Henderson proved that her apology was genuine by changing how she ran her music class. She started incorporating more diverse composers into the curriculum, teaching the students about ragtime, jazz, and other musical traditions that she had previously ignored. She also began asking David to share his knowledge with the class, treating him as a valuable resource rather than someone to be dismissed. One day, she approached David with an exciting opportunity. "There's a district-wide music competition coming up," she said. "Students can compete in different categories, and I think you should enter the piano solo division. Would you be interested?" David's eyes lit up. He had missed competing since moving to the new town, and the chance to perform again was thrilling. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'd love to." Mrs. Henderson helped him prepare for the competition, offering to stay after school to let him practice on the classroom piano. During these practice sessions, David saw a completely different side of his teacher. She was knowledgeable, encouraging, and genuinely passionate about music. It was clear that her behavior toward him initially had come from her own biases, rather than any lack of musical understanding. The day of the competition arrived, and David performed beautifully, playing a piece by Scott Joplin that blended classical technique with ragtime style. Mrs. Henderson sat in the audience, beaming with pride as her student took first place in his age category. After the competition, as they were walking back to the car, Mrs. Henderson stopped and turned to David. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "For what?" David asked, genuinely puzzled. "For not giving up on me," she replied. "For being gracious enough to let me learn and grow. You could have written me off as a lost cause after what I did, but instead you gave me a chance to become a better teacher and a better person." David smiled. "My grandmother always said that everyone deserves a second chance to do the right thing." Word of David's competition win spread throughout Riverside Elementary, and he became something of a local celebrity. The principal, Mr. Thompson, even invited him to play at the school's spring concert. But more importantly, David had found his place in his new school and community. Mrs. Henderson continued to change, becoming an advocate not just for David, but for all students who might face similar prejudices. She started a mentorship program that paired musically talented students with local musicians, regardless of their background or the assumptions people might make about them. Years later, when David had moved on to high school and was considering colleges with strong music programs, he received a letter from Mrs. Henderson. In it, she thanked him again for the lesson he had taught her and told him that he had fundamentally changed how she saw her role as an educator. "You didn't just play beautifully that day," she wrote. "You opened my eyes to the beauty I had been missing because of my own blindness. You made me realize that every student who walks into my classroom has potential I can't see until I take the time to really look." David kept that letter, along with the many awards and recognitions he earned as he continued his musical journey. But the memory he treasured most was not of his performance that day in the music room, but of the conversation afterward, when Mrs. Henderson had found the courage to apologize and the wisdom to change. His grandmother had been right, as she so often was. Music truly was a universal language, one that could break down barriers and change hearts when given the chance. And sometimes, the most important performance wasn't the one that earned applause, but the one that opened minds and created understanding, where there had been none before. The boy who had walked nervously into Riverside Elementary as an outsider had not only found his place but had helped create a more welcoming environment for every student who would come after him. And that, David realized, was perhaps the most beautiful music of all.